Tonight we're going to do something a little bit different. We've been having a 4-person panel, but we're going to do a one-on-one interview, and we're actually going to interview our Pastor Marcus, so come on up. Let's honor him again. Yeah, we're so thankful for everything that he carries and who he is. Yay. Yeah, here's water for you.
There we go. I don't know why I'm with flip-flops here, matching, Sandy, that's all. It's cold. I don't know.
This is going to be fun.
Yeah, it is going to be awesome.
It's going to be great.
Yeah,
we just wanted to change it up a little bit because we want to do some different things. This one I want to start kind of with getting to know our leaders a little bit. And one of the songs I've been listening to lately is called Good and Loved. And the first line says, it's the Lord speaking, and he says, through your story is my fingerprint. And all of us have that. All of us have God's fingerprint through our story. And we just want to hear a little bit about your story and how God's fingerprint is all throughout your whole life. And when I was thinking about this, we're just going to take it piece by piece because we don't want to brush over it because you have so many God stories of how God preserved your life, your whole family line, your destiny, how you ended up here, all those things. And so I just want to start with your cute little story about being born, and then we're going to go into your legacy. So if you just want to start with that because it's a fun, cute one to start with.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I was the third one born, and by that time my mom and dad were already in Bible school, and they already had decided to go on a mission field. And so my dad figured out that if he's on the mission field, he has to somehow figure out how to deliver babies. And so one of the things was that my brother and my sister, they were kind of born with somebody else in the hospital and also with a midwife. And so he figured I'm supposed to be born at home because that's how it's going to be over there. So I was born at home, and in August, and for whatever reason it was cold, because not always August is hot, like, you have cold days, whatever. I don't know, I just was born, but they had in the kitchen, actually, I was born, and my mom was worried that I was going to be born after my brother and sister woke up. She didn't want them waking up. So I was born in the kitchen. And then they, to keep me warm until they figured out my mom, they opened the oven door and just made out a little blanket there, and they put me there just to make sure that I keep nice and warm. So I didn't get a tan. But basically, it was just my mom and dad's idea of how to figure out, how to be knowledgeable about birth before they go on a mission field. So
was it where was that actually?
That was in Germany.
Oh, that was in
Germany.
Okay,
that was in Germany, in one of the home. I still remember that home. This is kind of the weird stuff. I remember things from being months old. I have still memories of that house. And actually, when I tell my mom that, she goes, "There's no way you would know these things. Like, how did we tell you that?" And I go, "No, I remember the sink being washed in. I remember the door, and I actually remember peeing behind the door once." I don't know why, but anyway, I just remember that. So, and sitting on the table where my dad literally would give us give us a haircut. We would sit on a little stool, and he'd give us like a buzz haircut. That's what was in back then. So
you were born in Germany, then you went to Bolivia, lived in Peru. Is that
we went to first of all we went to England because my parents had to learn English, and so we went there, and then after that we came back to Germany, and then we went from there to with a boat all the way to Chile, and then flew into the jungle of Bolivia. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're going to get more into that. Like I said, it's going to take more than one night, but I really want to focus tonight on your family line, on your dad's story, your mom's story, how God really preserved their lives and your destiny and your kids' destiny because of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So part of that I find is very interesting is that God has just an amazing way of, if you look at all the ways that God protects and rearranges, and everything under free will. None of it that he does, but he's still always sovereign and in charge of things. And if you look at our lineage, it is really amazing that actually I am here, because so many things literally could have gone wrong, and you'll see through some of the stories that I'm going to say that the enemy tried to annihilate our lineage of what our purpose and destiny is. And I don't know, you want to start with my dad or my mom? Which one do you want to start with?
It's up to you.
All right. It's up to me.
Yeah.
All right. My mom, let's start with my mom. My mom, basically, she was born in what back then used to be Czechoslovakia, but it was called Sudetenland, which is where a lot of Germans had moved 100 of years ago, and they had kind of made their little land over there. And when Hitler started trying dominating Europe, he basically annexed Czechoslovakia to Germany because there's so many Germans would live there. By the end of the war, that was 1945, my mom, by that time she was 2.5, 3 years old, they had actually, the Czechoslovakians, they said every German has to leave, and so they gave them 24 hours to leave. And so they didn't have anything else, but they just had to get out of there. And so all that they took was just a little Kinderwagen, what do you call it, a little stroller, put a duvet blanket, down blanket on her, and that was it. And they had to, by foot, literally go across the border into what we back then would call was the communist Germany. And they actually were there. They lived there for about 10 years, but in the beginning, they basically lived in refugee camps, just really not a pretty place to be, and they actually were not treated well at all. They were treated like you would today. You would see everybody refugees would come in, that's how they would be treated. The interesting part of that was that in that process, my grandfather, he was in France, still with the German army, and he had, and I'm going to give you a couple towns. He was not in contact with my mom or with the family at all, although that's where they lived, which was in Sudetenland. The city was called Teitschen-Bodenbach. He was in France, and he had no idea where they were. He had no idea where they were, and he was just working in France. He didn't know where to go, what to do. And one of these days he was at the base, and he sees this truck drive by with the name of the town where he grew up in. And he actually runs to that guy and says, "Are you going to go to my town?" And he goes, "Yes." And France and the town is like probably 200 or 300 miles apart, if not more. And he says, "Yeah, I'm going to go." I said, "Can I write a letter to my mom and give it to, and can you give it to her?" And the guy said, "Yeah, sure, I'll do that." So basically he wrote a letter asking, do you know where my wife and my kid are? And through that intervention, that's how he found them. And he literally walked from France on foot, trying to avoid the Russians, because he was still a German soldier. He was not allowed to be seen, or because they would have taken him in and shipped him off to Siberia. So he had to, for all the time that it took him to walk from France by foot all the way over to where my parents were, to the town. He finally got there, and my mom remembers the story where she was upstairs, and downstairs was a store, and actually the lady came out, "Hey, I want to show you somebody who wants to see you," and actually that's when she found her dad. But again, the beautiful part of that process is that God literally, he just makes this truck come by that has the town name on it, and he's in France, and he literally searches for them, and he basically, the way that worked is that he got a letter back from his mom. He waited at this place in France until he got a letter back from his mom saying, "This is where they live, this is the address," and then he made his way over there. From my mom's side, my grandmother, is that she was born in Teitschen-Bodenbach, that's where the town was, and she was born of a family, she had her mom had 4 sisters, and her mom had died early on in life after giving birth to her, and so she was taken care of by one of her sisters that later on had another kid, and she says, "I can't take care of her," so she was given to another sister to raise. And in that process, what had happened, that one of the cousins that she lived with had given his life, he met a Methodist girl. And that Methodist girl actually was a really saved Methodist girl, and he became a Christian, and he told my grandmother about the Lord, and that's how she got saved. And ever since then, my grandmother was saved, and she had a relationship with the Lord, and she by the time she left Tetschen-Bodenbach and actually had to go over to, which would be communist Germany, it was a real rough time for them because they were not looked at as normal citizens. They were not respected, they didn't get jobs or nothing, and by this time my grandfather was with them. And they lived there for 10 years, and they would actually at night go over to the other side and try to get food because they had no work and no food. And so they'd have to go over there and get food at night, ask the farmers to get them some food, and they would go over at night and then have food throughout the day. That's what they would do. And as they were trying to survive like this for many years, they my grandfather tried to get a job, and on the application it says, do you have any people that live in East Germany, West Germany? And he says, yeah, do you have any relatives? And he said, yes. Well, because he said yes, he didn't get the job. And that ticked my grandmother off. She says, this is it, we need to get out of here.
So why is that, though? Why would it be that they
because
didn't
how can I say this? The type of Germans, they call them the Sudetendeutsche, which is a type of German that actually left Germany, and they lived in this area, and they probably 200-300 years they lived there, and they were not really respected because they felt like, once the war was over, everything was people groups and nationalities and everything else. It wasn't really pretty, so a lot of people did not. If you were not from their culture and from their thing, they would not really particularly enjoy you. Or give you any kind of, and the thing is, my grandmother was a city girl, and everybody over there were farmers. They were just the poorest of farmers, and they had no grit for a city girl, with running and away from, with all the situations that they lived in. But so, and at that point they said, okay, we need to be able to, we need to escape from here. The wall was already built between East and West Germany, but the wall had not been finished built in Berlin. And so they knew, they connected the underground, and they figured out, how do we get over to East Germany? And they started connecting with the underground, and found out that there's a train that takes them from where they were at to Berlin. But the problem is, if anybody, because they were constantly checking, the Russians were constantly checking people, where are you traveling? Then if they would have figured out that he was a soldier, if they would have figured out that he was taking his family trying to escape, they would have shipped them off to Siberia. So basically, it was a real arduous time, because my mom at that point, she was 14 years old. Her brother was 5 years younger than her, and then her sister was 10 years younger than her. So we're talking, there's a family, 5. And so then they went on a train, and the train was, my mom says that when she was on that train, my grandfather was just frozen with fear, because they would constantly check papers, and they were in this caboose, in this, like you see in the movies, there's different cabins. And he was sitting with his family in the cabin, had the 2 suitcases, only 2 suitcases. And the suitcase, my grandmother put silverware in there. Why would she put silverware in there? Nobody knows, but she did. And they were sitting with another gentleman in there. And they actually came in and checked. And my grandfather thought, of course, he's going to ask me. But he didn't. He asked the other guy, opened his luggage, checked everything out, and they left. So that actually got them into Berlin. But then Berlin, they had to actually go with to East Berlin, East Berlin, and they had to go to West Berlin, and that was go but with the speed line. And that was, again, scary, because that was the only thing that was running still, and that was the only way to get out. And again, they got on the train, and they actually made it out with no incident. But once they made it to East Berlin, at that point, then it took them a couple of weeks to get the German papers done, and they actually the German government flew them over into Frankfurt, down to Stuttgart, where they were, and that's where they lived in some big refugee camps until they got placed some places. And that was not a pretty sight either, because you had like tons of families just separated by curtains in big halls, and that's where they lived. And so all in all, their life was, if you look at it, where I am today, and how God orchestrated that life and kept my mom alive and brought her here through this type of a, that's amazing. Now, if you go to my dad's side is his mom had an arranged marriage. She had a sister, and her sister had died, and the sister had a son, and the son had tuberculosis, and the only way that he would have been able to survive is to get medical care, but nobody had the ability to go into a doctor. So she lived in an apartment on the bottom floor, and on the third floor on the top was a guy who would drive the train for the German government. And I think he was in his 50s, and she was in her 30s, or late 20s, early 30s. And she basically went upstairs, knocked on the door, and said, if you marry me, would you be willing to marry me so I can save my sister's son? And he said, yeah, sure, I will. So that's how they got married in that kind of a time frame, and that way they were able to save her whatever that means, the nephew. So she had actually another 3 boys with him. That's where my dad is the last one. But so that's how my dad came to be in 1940, and obviously a Second World War broke out back then, and so he was driving the train for the Nazis, and he was a train driver. That's what he did. And my grandmother was just taking care of the boys. That's what she was doing. And many times when the raids were, because Germany was carpet bombed, many times, and Kiev was definitely carpet bombed. So every time my dad would say, they would hear the sirens go off, then my mom would take all the boys and they would go into the bunker, which was a couple of blocks away from the house. And he remembers one time, shortly before the war was over, that they heard the sirens, and her mom took them, everybody, and they said every time they would go out of the bunker, they would always go back, is the house still there? Is the house not there? And this particular time, she took the 4 boys and she ran to the bunker, and the bunker door was just closing, and she puts her foot in the door, and she says, I need to get my 4 kids in there. And the guy says, no, it's full. And she goes, no, I need to get my 4 kids in there. And they said, okay. So they actually got him, or the kids and her, in there, and then they closed the door, and everybody else stayed outside. When they walked back outside, everybody outside was dead. And they literally had to walk over those bodies and go out. So if you just look at those stories in itself, it's an amazing way how God orchestrates things and turns everything for good, but he uses amazing ways, even when the enemy wants to annihilate you and he knows the destiny is awesome, he knows that, but he can't, because God supernaturally somehow makes those things happen. So
yeah. And as he's talking, that's one of the things that we really want to be watching for and listening for is, number one, where's the sovereignty of God? How is God bringing all things together for good? Because there's so much in there that any one of them could have said, this is really unfair. How come I have to have an arranged marriage? Or why was I needing to be born in a communist country or during the war? Or all these things. And there's so much persistence and there's so much faithfulness of the Lord and of people to not even knowing that they're actually what they're doing is bringing about this whole beautiful destiny that's going to go way down your line and into your kids' line and way into the future here, but started way over in a different part of the world. So that's one thing that we want to be listening for. And also I want to encourage us to be listening for what is the Lord speaking to your heart through his story? Because we're here, we're actually a part of this story. You're a part of his legacy, because the Eric family is leading this church, and so we get to say, wow, you know what, God placed him here for a reason and a purpose. I'm here for a reason and a purpose, and I can take these testimonies for myself too and go, Lord, I know that when it feels unfair or it feels like I want to give up, I'm going to keep going, because there's so much good that's going to come out of it. Yeah.
And the thing for me is, if you look at it, how God starts orchestrating, you start honoring my grandfather, you start honoring my grandmother, you start honoring the people who actually put out so much to bring all that to pass. You know, sometimes we just poo-poo everything and they did everything wrong and whatever else they did. But we actually come to a place in our lives where we see, okay, God, you orchestrated through such difficult times.
Yeah.
The free will of men, you still orchestrated sovereignly and supernaturally in so many areas. I mean, for my grandfather to say, okay, I'm going to walk all the way from France all the way over there. I mean, hiding for so many days and however long that took him to do that. I mean, and again, like Sandy said, nobody was, I mean, it probably wasn't fair. It probably wasn't a lot of things. But yet at the same time, we moved on. You know, we still did what we did. And it was a tough life if you hear them talk about it. And I remember when I lived in Germany, talking to my grandmother every night, it was, okay, and the war. And like, okay, here we go again. And, you know, I was a kid back then. I said, just shut up about the war. But the older I got, the more interested I get. Okay, what did you really go through? Yeah. Because what you went through actually formed my mother and my dad, you know. And I think the older you get, the more you actually recognize that people who have invested a lot of time and a lot of effort into living and coming out and what they had to do in order for them to continue living. If they would have given up somewhere in the middle of it and they would have done it, I wouldn't be here.
And neither would we. We wouldn't be in the
exactly.
same place.
Yeah. So a lot of that, if you start looking, there is so many things where God's hand is just totally invading this place. So.
Yeah, that's good. And that's just another reminder for us, too. We have so many in this house. We have grandmas and grandmas and great-grandmas and great-grandpas that have a story of God's faithfulness in their life. All of us do, but it's so important that we really ask each other, where was God's faithfulness in your life? That we're sharing our stories, that we're getting these pieces of legacy and destiny from each other, because we're all knit together in a family. That's one of the reasons why we're doing this, because stories are so powerful. If I know your story and you know my story, we're so much more connected, and I understand where you're coming from, and you can understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, too, is if you look at even my grandmother, for example, I mean, living life in a very unfair way. She didn't decide to live in Sudetenland. That was her parents and her parents, you know. Yeah. And then she got thrown out. But she tried to make the best of it. And if she would have decided just to screw it all, but she didn't, you know. And I find it like, if we start finding the sacrifices of the other people, what they've done, you start honoring actually your life a lot more, because you go, hey, they put a lot of effort into this life. Mm-hmm. I have to maybe put a lot of effort in this too. Yeah, that's good. I can't just screw it up. Mm-hmm. You know, they didn't fight so hard to keep on the genealogy alive of what God is doing. I need to take my ownership too. If they put so much work in it, I need to put my work in it too. Yeah. And I find that to me, that's the thing that always, you know, if God had my grandmother put the foot in the door so he doesn't die, then I need to honor that with my life, in the way I do my choices, and the way, you know, that's important. And we sometimes don't look at those things, and maybe you don't know all those things, but I feel even if we don't know them, ask God to just give you somehow an honor to the people of your lineage, because you don't know what they all went through. And they're not here complaining about it. I never, you know, there was not a big complaint about it. You know, that was a tough life they had to live, especially coming out of Second World War. That's not easy. You know, my mom, I think she just had 7 years of schooling. That's it, you know. And then she lived in concentration camps and lived as a refugee most of her life until she literally got married at 18. So it's not like she had the life. Yeah. And when she went to school in the communist Germany, she literally was the only kid that didn't go to communist schooling, to the youth, communist youth. They had a communist youth, and everybody in the school was into that. And my grandmother said to her, "You're not going to be part of that." So she was the only kid that was not a part of that. I mean, it's not like she was the hot lady that, oh yeah, you know, she was somewhat the outcast, somewhat just not really the in girl either. And you're living in that time where you don't have food, you don't have anything, but they kept on moving forward. You know, they kept on saying, I'm pressing in. And I think sometimes we like to always have our comfort zone and everything else, and we have it so good compared to what they did. Mm-hmm. And that's not putting shame on anything, but we have to start thinking, if their lineage was so hard to continue to get to where we are, what are we doing to honor what they did? Yeah. Yeah. What are we doing to honor what they did? How hard did they have to fight, and are we fighting at least that hard? Yeah. Are we at least doing that much? Because if we're not, then we're wasting what they did.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, and I also think along that same line is, I think, what stories will my daughter and my grandkids have about me? You want powerful stories for your kids and grandkids to be telling about you someday, that someone's interviewing them and they're saying, oh, and my grandpa did this, or my great-grandpa did that, and how he was faithful to the Lord and how the Lord was so sovereign in his life. So yeah, on both sides of that, we want to look at the generations past and forward.
Yeah, and I don't know if you want to go to the place where my mom and dad met.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, if you look at that situation, my mom lives in the southern part of Germany, and my dad lives all the way in the northern part of Germany. So they're about 700 kilometers apart, which is about 500 miles apart. And they don't know each other from Adam. So just think about this. My dad goes in the military, and he becomes a parachute jumper in Germany, and he does a real good job. He supposedly was the second best in the time that he was there. He was doing a good job. He loved it. He was doing the thing. And he was stationed in the southern part of Germany. And my mom was at and I don't know what this is called, but it's Fasching is what we call Halloween, but they don't do Halloween like we do Halloween. That's all weird. But if they just do Fasching. A lot of people get drunk out of their minds and whatever, but that's what they do. So my mom and dad, they're at this place, unbeknownst, my mom's dancing with this guy, and I don't know who this guy is. And my dad's sitting there, and my mom just looks at him and thinks, well, he looks kind of like, sad or whatever, so she winks at him. And then she goes to the bathroom. That's really good, always wink and then go to the bathroom. So she winks, she goes back, and she comes back, and my dad's standing there and says, do you want to dance? And my mom says, yeah, sure, I'll dance with you. So they danced the rest of the night, and he walked her home, and that was it. So they kind of hooked up. And long story short, they got pregnant before time was due, and so they had to get married. And at that point, they actually got married, and that wasn't pretty from my mom's parents' side. That wasn't really fun. That wasn't really good, but they got married, and they started having issues, obviously. And Billy Graham came into town, and he had an evangelistic campaign there, and they both went there, and they got saved that night at the Billy Graham's crusade. So if you just take that, and then my dad was actually discipled by some German nuns, which were Christian nuns, not Catholic nuns, Christian nuns, and he literally, for a number of years, was discipled by them. I mean, that's impressive. And by this time, he had a good job, and he was making a ton of money, really good money. And then he just felt like the Lord called him into Bible school. So he sold everything. And everybody said, you are an absolute idiot. And he sold everything, and he says, no, I'm going to go to Bible school. And my mom said the same thing. And the stories that they have, how God financially provided baskets of food when they had nothing anymore, how they would have baskets of food literally drop in front of their house, how money came to them, all this kind of stuff. They literally went to Bible school on faith alone, and they actually walked through all these years. I think it was 4 years or 3 years that they had to go to Bible school. That's what they did. And then my dad, I believe the story was that he read a book of Watchman Nee, and by the time he came to the end of the Watchman Nee book, I don't know which one, because he had read quite a bit of them, he felt like God called him to be a missionary. And then when he told that to my mom's parents, wasn't the thing that they wanted to hear. And so it was interesting, because yet in spite of opposition, that's what he did. And I find it that if you look at how God orchestrates, if you see all this destruction, all the war and everything else, but he brings a couple from two different sides of the spectrum and brings them together and puts them into a place, and they give their life to the Lord. And because they both decided, we're doing this, against all odds, they fought that fight. And I feel like when we start looking at all the things that our ancestors did and how much they fought for something, then we can't live our life today with a flippant attitude. We can't live our life with an attitude of saying, well, who cares? Well, I'll do whatever I want. Please don't do whatever you want. Because if you do whatever you want, then you're really not honoring all the sacrifices that they did. And I find it interesting, especially from my parents, the perspective of how they walked that life out, and they had, it was difficult for them, I mean, it wasn't an easy cake. I mean, he made good money for years, and now he had to go, he went to Bible school, and he believed wholeheartedly. And that was not easy. And after that, then, you have to, now you have to jump through a lot of hoops. You have to go to England, learn the language. Okay, and by this time, we're all there. I was there, my brother was there, my sister was there. So it wasn't just like them too. They had 3 kids, and they're moving their whole family. So these are sacrifices that people are making. So I think that was just...
Yeah, that's good. Any questions from anybody out there before we move on? I just want to make sure anybody has a question they wanted to ask or anything they wanted to clarify. Okay, then let's go. Tell us, you have this story about your dad's friend and how you were going on the boat, and it's so sweet, yeah.
Yeah, he was one of my dad's best friends back then, and actually he's still alive. They still have connections somewhat, but he basically, when they went to England, they basically learned English, and they got some really good friends over there in England, and then they came back, and then I remember the time when we basically had to go. My dad we had put a lot of things in barrels. That's what you did back then in 1969, and we put it on shipped it over in a boat. But we ourselves went in a boat. So we had to go down to Italy, that's Genoa, which is the port where our boat left from. And so his friend basically and our car, we went, and somebody had to drive this car back. And we drove all the way down there. And then when we were ready to get onto the boat, he's the one who literally, when we went on the board, he got his trumpet out, and as long as the boat would drive out, he would play my dad's favorite song on the trumpet, until you could not hear him anymore. And then we walked from there. I think we went through out the Mediterranean all the way down to South Africa to Rio de Janeiro, through the Panama Canal, all the way down to Chile, Arica. And then from there, we took a airplane ride all the way into the jungle of Bolivia, Cochabamba, where the 1 year of Bible school of a language in Spanish was. So they learned English to talk to the English missionaries that were all learning Spanish. And that's basically what we learned at that point. We learned all 3 languages by the time we were there. Half a year, we were fluent in all of them as kids. That's normal, but for them, that was a little tough ride. And I remember my mom said that because when you fly into Cochabamba, it's just high mountains. It's a mountainous area, and she said the first Sunday, she said to my dad, "I want to climb those mountains and see what's above those mountains," because she felt like, "Are you kidding? Where on earth am I? And am I ever going to get back out of here?" And she literally, I remember that we went up that mountain, and then she says, "And when I climbed that mountain, all I saw is more mountains." And back then, when you were a missionary, you did not get to go home before 5 years. They made you stay there for 5 years. And so you get immersed in culture and everything else. So the first time you actually get to go home is 5 years. You get to go 1 year home. And that was a tough one for them. Yeah. For my mom more than my dad. My dad, he was more the adventurous guy anyway, And he was like ready to go. And there's many stories there, but yeah, that was the...
And how old were you when you actually were
I was 4.5.
Okay.
I turned 5 by the time we got to Bolivia.
Yeah. And then how long were your parents missionaries altogether? How long were they?
They left in 2006 or 2007. I think that's when they left Peru. Okay. Yeah, so that was a long time. So 1969, that's when they started. So you're talking 30, 40, 45, 40 some years that there were missionaries out there.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, we just honor that. We're so thankful. We're so thankful, yeah, for the legacy that they carry and this what we get from that. I want to save a little bit of time at the end, so I don't want to jump into too much more of your years after that. But maybe just tell us one or two memories that you have, whether it's on the boat or the travel or when you first got there, some like a powerful memory that you have of that time.
I think for me as a kid, it was just the boat was the funnest part because you always got to eat, and we were in the second turn, and we always, to this day, we know exactly what the loudspeaker always said. So we remember the boat ride and the waves on the little windows when we were in the boat, and you see the waves coming up through the windows. It was a long boat ride. It was 3.5, 4 weeks or 5 weeks. I don't know. It was a long boat ride. And the Panama Canal, that was fun going there. I remember that. And I remember the flight that we had to go with was a propeller machine they called, was the Electra plane, which I don't know, Boeing made it, was 4 propellers. And we had to fly with that thing, and my brother and sister, they just sat in the plane. As soon as the plane took off, they started throwing up like crazy. It was just awful. It was just awful. And then I didn't throw up the whole plane. I just threw up as soon as I walked down the stairs. And my parents thought, oh my gosh, how embarrassing this is, you know. But hey, you travel with kids, and I remember the planes, they had the little bags that we really used. So, yeah, I mean, those are the things that I think for us, you know, we always had fun as kids. We always just played around. For us, this was, we didn't care about anything. We just were like, this is great, you know. When my dad went on the jungle trips and stuff, you know, we were like ecstatic. My mom was like, what the heck? You know, we see snakes eating things and everything else. We go over these drawbridges like where the Indians made them from. There's a rushing river on the mountain, like the Travel Channel. We would drive in riverbeds. Our car would get stuck, and we're like, you know, we're having the time of our lives, literally, you know. My dad enjoyed it too. He was just like, this is great, you know. He has stories to tell, plenty of them, but I mean, from what I remember, we had a ton of fun. My dad would be preaching, and in this one town, and you know, and they had all these every house had a little bit of a lagoon in front of them. Don't ask me why, but they did. But some people had a lot of ducks, and some people didn't have enough ducks, or some people didn't even have any ducks in it. And I thought, well, let's get the ones that there's 20 ducks in this small little lagoon. Let's put them over in the other lagoon that is bigger and has no ducks, right? Well, I didn't know that basically the ducks stayed there because that's where they're supposed to live. They're not supposed to live there. So here I am, the dad who's preaching. I'm the one who is like out there running with the ducks, stealing the ducks and putting them over here, and they're yelling, what are you doing? You know, I always loved animals. But anyway, so those are the things that I did, and, you know, it was fun. I mean, my dad was preaching, and, you know, he would baptize people in the rivers, and then there was around him, there's people with bamboo sticks beating the water, make sure the crocodiles wouldn't come. And then he would be baptizing all the people in the middle, you know. And we're running around. We're just happy to be out there in the middle of nowhere, you know. My mom says, just don't touch anything, don't get eaten. But we're just, seriously, we had a good time. My brother, my sister, and then with all the other missionaries' kids, we were just like, I don't know, it was just a wild ride for us. I would say everybody should have that.
There we go. You can lead the next mission trip. There we go.
Like we would have chickens in the yard, and you know, if you have a maid, everybody has a maid, so it's not like you're the rich person. Everybody has a maid, and my mom and dad, they always would pick the young girls that don't have parents, so they would come and live with us, and then they would help them. So we'd have chickens in the backyard, and my mom would say, okay, we'll have chicken. And she would go out and cut a chicken's head off, and then the chicken would fly until it wouldn't fly anymore, and all the blood's out, and then she'd rip the thing out. And it's like, that's what we would do, you know? It's like, that's life to us. That was like, good.
Good stories. All right, we have like 7 minutes, and what I want to do is the main thing that I wanted to hear tonight was really that sovereignty of God in protecting a lineage and protecting a whole family line.
So let me tell you
Go
one
ahead,
story about
yeah.
that, because that'll fit into that. So one of them, if you asked me for a member, I'll give you one. So my brother and I, we're not supposed to drive with our bicycle outside of the house, and because we couldn't fit on the bicycle with that has the bar in between, right? So we would drive with the bar over us, and we put our leg through the side, so we drive like this. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? All right. My brother drove the girl bike, but I drove my dad's bike through the leg because I couldn't get there. And there was a motorcycle coming this way, and I was driving. I don't know what happened. I tried to avoid him, but I obviously didn't, but I don't remember anything. So I just pick up the bike and I just run back home, and my brother runs back home, and we're all fine. Nobody's here. So at night, the maid, she's giving me a shower and stuff, and she sees motorcycle tracks all over my back. Mm-hmm. And she goes, and she calls my mom, and she goes, Ms. Monica, you got to see this. So my mom comes in, what do I need to look at? And she goes, I have motorcycle tracks all over my back. So the motorcycle literally, I passed out, obviously. He drove over me, thought I died. I didn't die, but that's basically what happened. So just, if you're looking at this, every single part, and I have tons of more stories, but those are the things that you look at. Okay, God has a plan, that the enemy already at the young age wants to try to take people's lives away. But God says, no, I have a plan.